Well, welcome to this week's episode of the Speak with People podcast, where we believe that words matter, and we want to help you become a better, more effective communicator, whether one-on-one or in a small group, from a stage or from behind a camera. And so this week, we are so incredibly pleased, so incredibly blessed, so incredibly delighted. Man, I got so many kind of great words right there to have a longtime friend, Mark Oestricher, on the podcast. Well, welcome, Marco.
Yeah, thanks. Good to see you.
Good to see you. It's so nice to have you here. Could you just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, what you do, all that kind of stuff?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm a 40-year youth ministry veteran,
Wow.
and started in Michigan, and
Go
you
Blue.
and I have some common roots. Yep. And then moved across the country as a junior high pastor. I love junior hires. It's kind of my jam. And then back in 98, I moved to San Diego to work at Youth Specialties, which, for people who don't know, still exists, but it used to be kind of very much the leader in training and resourcing youth workers. And I spent most of my years there as the president. And then that organization got sold in 2009, and I lost my job. So I started a new thing called the Youth Cartel. I just realized that yesterday, as of when we're recording this, was my 12-year anniversary of that layoff from Youth Specialties.
Wow.
So I was at YS for 11 years, but I've been gone now for 12 years.
Wow.
Youth Cartel is in similar space. We basically do two things. We're a publisher for youth workers, and then we run a year-long coaching program. It's like a whole life leadership development program for youth workers in cohorts of 10. And we've had 700 people go through that. So it's doing well. We have 5, 6, or 7 cohorts a year all around the country. Married to Jeannie for 36 years, and we have 2 kids. They're 28 and 24. Jeez. And live together with a few other people in a house about 15 minutes away from us. So
that's fantastic.
That's my life. And I'm sitting at my desk, which is a picnic table in my backyard. A nice advantage that San Diego provides for me. This is literally my only desk. If it's too hot or too cold, I go inside. But otherwise, this is where I sit.
Well, it's freezing in Tampa today. It was like 46 degrees this morning. So
wow,
people are losing their minds.
Yeah.
They're in parkas.
I bet.
Poor little lizards are falling out of the trees.
Awesome.
Well, Marco, I can still remember meeting you for the first time because I was junior high pastor, of course, knew who you were. And one of my volunteer leaders invited me to come over for dinner. And I'll still remember, he's like, hey, come over for dinner. My brother-in-law is going to be there. And I was like, okay, he didn't tell me who you were. He didn't tell me your name. But I was like, okay, free meal. I mean, I'm in my 20s or whatever. Like, let's go. Yeah. And I walk in and I'm like, oh, well, hi, how you doing? Like, literally I had the whole clammy, palmy, my palms and my mom. I was like, oh, what do I do? It's Marco. Like, this is crazy.
And by the end of that time, you thought, he's a normal guy.
When you put your pants on like everybody else, in the end,
my shorts.
It's
usually not pants.
Your shorts. But when you do put your shorts on, though, you write. I was trying to go with the cowbell joke there, but I messed it up.
Wow, I didn't see that.
The great SNL skit, Yeah,
I know.
When you put, anyways, all right, it's horrible.
I don't know how it was. I didn't see how it was going to tie into where you were going, but okay.
It was horrible. Hey, it was just horrible.
Clearly.
Just awful. Well, hey, we want to dedicate this podcast to talking about speaking with teenagers, communicating with, the next generation. And it is so drastically changed. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Even in my own life, my oldest is 22. The youngest is 8. My 8-year-old, he'll grow up not knowing what life is. I mean, if the iPad battery dies, like, it is a family emergency, everything's going to go, crazy. and he has autism, so we kind of navigate all of that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
speaking with teenagers, so as we think about communicating with teenagers, what's the most important thing? Especially like I'm Gen X, my parents are Boomers. What do we need to know about communicating with teenagers in 2022?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is not a direct answer. It's just that I have pushback to generational
Mm,
studies and caricatures. I think they're unfair and often fairly inaccurate.
okay.
But I think there's a reframe that works, and that's to acknowledge that culture is always changing,
Mm,
and there's certainly times when it changes more dramatically. And in our current cultural reality, it's fair to say that teenagers and young adults are indigenous to this culture. It's
mm,
all they've ever known. So it shapes them in particular ways based on that reality. Whereas you and I are immigrants to this culture. We're still living in the same culture that they are. Uh, and it's just that it impacts us in a different way because we're immigrants to it.
right.
Um, so I do think there have been some pretty significant changes in culture over the last, well, I would say 75 years or so.
Mm,
Um, Kind of the modern era of youth culture, which started at the end of World War II. It really started because in the US, every state adopted mandatory secondary education laws that went through grade 12. So it was kind of the invention of the American high school that birthed youth culture
right.
as we think of youth culture today. But what I see so often when I talk to parents, particularly, or church leaders who are older, this would often be true with senior pastors, especially if they used to be a youth pastor, um, is that people have they have a misunderstanding about the experience of being a teenager today
Mm,
because they're basing their understanding on what they remember about their own teenage years. And the tendency is to look back on your own teenage years, whatever faulty memory that would be, right? And then either see that through utopian lenses or dystopian lenses.
mm,
To either see it as it was the best time of my life. And that's probably colored as much by Hollywood and other information sources that feed
right.
into that, and then they get a kid who's kind of mopey and walking around the house looking sad, and the parent says, why are you always so mopey? Don't you know that this is the best time of your life? It's never going to get better than this. And the kid's
Right.
thinking, if that's true, I'm screwed because this sucks. um,
Right.
or on the other extreme, parents and educators and ministry leaders often look back with dystopian lenses. Maybe they had some trauma in their teenage years, or they remember it being difficult or lonely or whatever it was. And they assume and that that's the experience of all teenagers and project that on
Mm,
them. Now, that's not really about cultural change as much it is just that we we tend to, us adults, especially those who aren't working daily with teenagers, we tend to make assumptions about what it's like to be a teenager. And those are often not all that accurate, right?
right.
If we're going to talk about how to characterize the change that's taken place, it, the full answer is probably a little more long than makes sense for this format. But the shorthand is that belonging and the search for belonging has become the lens through which the average teenager views everything. So my
Wow.
search for belonging helps me understand who God is and what my relationship with God is. My search for belonging informs who I am. So, I mean, this is a critical search, a change. Teenagers in the 50s and 60s were trying to figure out identity first, and that would inform where they should look for belonging. Today,
Right.
teenagers are looking for belonging, and then that will tell them who they are. That'll answer their identity quest. Um, so it just informs everything. And that calls on us then to offer meaningful places of belonging prior to belief.
Right.
Um, yeah,
Right.
so a big shift on that.
I can't even imagine. I middle school years I dealt with. I was a shorter guy, a little stockier. Dealt with a good amount of I like to say lovingly stocky. But a good amount of bullying. But the bullying didn't come home with me. It only came home in my mind.
Uh,
Now our
yeah,
kids. It's like they can't escape it. And I was
right.
thinking through what you said, the sense of belonging. Uh, it's just amazing. I think about this generation and their desire. It's for every generation, but the desire for likes. How much of that identity do they get from their online identity? It's just crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an enormous challenge, and it's a complex one. Because on one hand, let's say a positive side, um, yeah, there's a couple positive things, right? One is we obviously all like it. I
Oh
mean,
yeah,
I use social media way more than my 20 something kids. They tease me about it. And so, there are advantages, right? I don't want to dismiss those. Then the other thing is the lead researcher on teenagers and social media use. Her name's Dana Boyd. She says that what teenagers are doing in social space is just the same thing that they've always needed to do for developmental reasons,
mm,
but they used to do it in public places. So the mall, the park, things like that, the neighborhood, but that for the most part in America, those public places are no longer available to teenagers. We used to hang around the mall, and that's no longer really allowed. That kind of loitering, you could
right,
call it, around the mall,
right,
right? And with the safety concerns that a lot of parents have, whether they're warranted or not, um, kids often don't have the access to just roam the neighborhood or hang out at the park by themselves, right? So instead, they went to use a technology that had already been built. By the way, social media was not intended to do what it's now doing.
mm,
Um, and teenagers made it what Boyd calls a networked public, a place where they're working out the regular tasks of adolescence
wow,
in an online space because that's what's available to them. So that's the good, you could say, good or more positive side of it. It's the vast majority of interactions that teenagers have in an online space is with friends that they have in real life. And it's just an extension of that. Of course, there's all kinds of threats, and it's all been well documented.
sure,
And the quantity of not just bullying, but all kinds of other stuff,
sure,
unhealthy things. Our kids aren't getting enough sleep because they sleep with their phones and they end up waking up all night long anytime a notification comes in.
right.
And Yeah, just the quantity, what it does to our brains, has well documented negative repercussions. So, if you are a parent listening to this, one of the implications is to try to figure out what are some healthy boundaries that would allow my kid to engage in this space, but not in a way that minimizes the potential damage.
Mm.
Um, and my proposal is they need to be family rules, not just rules for the teenagers. If they're just rules for the teenagers,
Wow.
it ends up feeling hypocritical
Right, because
and
the
really
parents are like, "I
unfair.
pay for it, so I don't
Yeah,
have to do it. You have to do it."
yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, we had a rule in my family. I think it's a good rule that devices are not allowed at the dinner table.
Mm.
We tried to have dinner together as a family multiple times a week. And that got more and more challenging as the kids got older, but there was a commitment to a certain amount of those per week. And I'll tell you, part of the reason for that is because clear research came out from Fuller Youth Institute that showed this direct connection to kids who held on to their faith beyond youth group, as they moved into their 20 something years. One of the closest parallels were that those kids had dinner with their family when they were in
Wow.
their teenage years.
Wow.
Um, but that meant all of us couldn't have our devices at the table. And more often than not, the person who violated the rule was me. and I'd pull out my phone for something because I felt the buzz in my pocket,
Right.
and my kids would call me on it. So it was a family rule. Another family rule we had was that we did not sleep with our devices. So,
Oh,
like, to this day, even though my kids are out of the house, my phone charges in the bathroom. I don't want it next to my bed. Um,
wow. Yeah.
nothing is going to happen that really demands my attention that can't wait till morning. Um, and so we had that expectation of our kids too, and we had the same when we were going through some years where it really seemed to be an issue, kind of the middle teen years. It was We also had a rule that you couldn't use your devices in your room with the door closed. So
Oh,
that kind of use of your devices was, and whether that was your laptop or whatever, was
right.
supposed to be reserved for the public spaces of the house. Um, so yeah, I've never really been one who believes in the kind of filters and things that are out there. There's ways around them,
Yeah,
and it's
absolutely.
kind of a policing. But we had a series of boundaries, and then we also had a series of checks that
Yeah.
we would work with our kids. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. As you were saying that about the open policy, my 18-year-old sitting next to me, and that one intrigued him. He was like, "Oh, that would be a different." Because right now we don't have that one in our household, but it's not a bad one. And that's absolutely fantastic. It's interesting though. You see such a parallel for how kids react to even how their parents react online. It's like
Oh yeah.
it's like, oh, where'd you learn that? Oh, okay. Okay. Like
Right.
your mom
Right.
regularly or your dad regularly, spills all the family drama. Oh, okay. Like, oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah,
That's a tough one.
for sure.
It's just crazy though, the identity thing. Our 8-year old, he's a second grader, loves life, loves technology. Now he does have
Mm.
autism, and so he does have an affinity towards, he loves kind of doing the same game, the same process, but just the thought of him being able to have his own YouTube channel someday, like that, he gets so incredibly excited. What do you want to do someday, Kai? I want to be a YouTuber. What kind of YouTuber do you
Uh-huh.
want to be? I want to play Minecraft and show people how I do it. Like he's just, it's just amazing that that's already at 8.
Yeah.
That's what he wants to do.
Right. Yeah.
So
Right.
communicating with teenagers. So I have some friends who own businesses and they employ, teenagers. Let's talk for a second about how we can communicate to, teenagers, students in the workplace, because this person's always telling me he's just got some frustration because it's like, you know in his words, they just don't respond like they used to 20 years ago.
Hmm.
And so I know some of the stuff we've already covered will be, I mean, really good for, some of those folks to listen to. But is there anything else, if somebody's going in blind, hey, I need to remember maybe some of these practices to kind of dig into a conversation with a teenager, to kind of get in there and communicate.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the principles of communicating one on one with a teenager are the same as they would be for communicating with any adult.
Right.
Um, right.
Right.
And I think so often it's just that we're the problem. We assume that somehow that teenagers are this alien species that require a whole different language set or whatever. And that's not what teenagers are looking for in a relationship that matters with an adult. They're looking for somebody who's themselves and authentic, right? Not somebody who's trying to pose as a
Right.
teenager or be hip or something like that, right? So, like right now
Right.
at my church, I'm leading a sixth grade boys small group, and um, whew, they're little and they're squirrely. And for if I like try to act like one of them or use their language or whatever, it's for one, it's just not going to be effective, but also I'm just going to come off as a total poser, right?
Right.
A total poser, and then I forfeit my influence. with them. So yeah, it's treating them with respect, right? I mean, this is a general communication
Yep.
principle for all ages. I want to treat the person I'm talking to with a level of respect, even if I don't know them.
Yep.
I want to have curiosity toward them to discover what it is that they need and what's important to them, what their values are.
Mm,
Um, I want to find things. I want to discover things that I can affirm, um, and to celebrate, right? And I want to speak to them, particularly when I'm talking to teenagers. I want to speak to them as if they were adults rather
right.
than as if they were children.
Right. That was something as we were parenting, I just saw my wife do really well because I'm from a smaller family. She had her parents had a million kids and then adopted a million kids. And so when we started having kids and toddlers, I was like, oh no, what are we going to do? And she's always been like a baby whisperer, toddlers. But that's the one thing she always did. She didn't speak to the toddlers like they were some alien or a different where
Uh,
we would find out. We'd go to other people's houses and they would talk to their toddlers. This is my opinion, like they talk to their
uh-huh.
dogs sometime, like
Yeah, no,
eh,
yeah, I get it.
but and then we do that to the same thing with teenagers, middle schoolers, high schoolers. And
Yeah.
sometimes it is hard though. I drive around my neighborhood and there are some middle school boys who will stare me down when I drive by. And I'm like, you know what? I grew up in Detroit. I have a bad back, but if my back wasn't bad, I'd be stopping this car and I would get out and I would show you. But that's not all the teenagers, but some of them I'm just like, man, if I would have had that confidence at 13,
Yeah,
that would have been
yeah,
incredible.
yeah, totally. I had
Absolutely.
some of that at times, but I knew I was putting on when I did things like that. I knew I was putting on a persona,
Mm,
right? And the reality is that's very normal for teenagers. They're trying things out, behavior wise, belief wise. They're trying things out to see, is this me? Does this feel right? Is this the kind of person I want to be? Is this the kind of way I want to project who I am? And, again, that's just a normal part of the adolescent development experience.
mm.
So we just need to not be freaked out by it.
That's right. So when it comes to parents, I know there's a lot of parents listening. A question I get frequently is, how can I communicate or can we disagree and still communicate, without the
Mm,
slam doors, the frustrations, you don't understand my life. Is there any words of advice you could speak into parents just about, having those conversations when you hit the disagreement level? What
yeah.
are a posture, some practices that you can take as you approach that with your teenagers.
We can address this for parents, but I think this is a helpful, broader question because I just regularly am finding myself as a communicator in places where I know some portion of the audience disagrees with me,
Mm,
right? So, like, I have gotten into this space where I'm regularly asked to speak to youth workers on pastoring LGBTQ teenagers.
mm,
And I did a seminar yesterday on this topic with a bunch of people. And I know there's disagreement in the room about theology and practice and different things. And one of the kind of little axioms, mantras that I've started, leaning into and trying to communicate is that community does not mean sameness, and friendship does not
mm.
require or imply sameness or uniformity.
Wow.
And our cultures become so tribal and so divided and divisive that there's this myth out there, and people on both sides of the political spectrum have this myth, and people on both sides of every theological conflict have this assumption that if I'm in meaningful relationship with you, then that infers I agree with you on everything,
Wow.
right? And so, like in the example that I just gave of talking to people about LGBTQ issues, the myth is if I'm friends with you or walk with you or whatever, go to your gay wedding or whatever it is, that I'm endorsing your sin, is the way it would often be phrased. And I would just say it's just not true.
Right.
We can be in meaningful, really meaningful relationships of respect, um, and affirmation and encouragement that is reciprocally offering belonging, that we don't agree on all kinds of things. I'm sure that, Jason, you and I, if we dug into a bunch of theological topics,
Sure.
we would find plenty of things that we disagree on, but
Yeah.
that does not diminish in any way our level of affection or respect for one another,
Right.
or the fact that we can genuinely call each other friends, right? So
Exactly.
let's move that over to the parent space, um, because, you know, so the implication is, yes, we can disagree without it destroying the relationship. the,
Right.
one of the challenges as a parent is that we often think the only resolve is for them to come to my position, my belief,
Right.
my
You have
whatever,
to
or
believe what I
whatever my
believe.
desire.
Yeah.
You have to believe what I believe, or you have to do what I'm telling you to do. And when we're talking teenagers, I mean, they are, I would say, intentionally and lovingly created to be in a space where they're figuring out what pushback looks like. It's all
Hmm.
part of, we've talked about a couple of the tasks of adolescence, belonging and identity, but there's a third one. The fancy word for it is autonomy, and it's about agency. It's how much do my choices matter? Like, can I actually make decisions that will change the trajectory of my own life? Can I can by my choices, what I say and do, can I influence my family
Mm.
and my friend group? And is it even possible that I could influence the world? That's this agency question of autonomy. And it's a normal, healthy part of being a teenager. But parenting somebody going through that can be super challenging.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Oh my goodness. Right.
Yeah. So I think there's, a couple principles for us as parents. And this is a broad communication principle too. We've got to embrace a posture of humility,
Yep.
right? You and I both know we've heard gifted communicators who come off as arrogant, and I just don't even care what they say. Doesn't
Yep.
matter how brilliant they are.
Yep.
Um, but man, a mediocre communicator who's got a clear sense of humility, I'll listen to them every day.
Yes.
Um, So,
Yep.
yeah, I want people to develop their communication skills, but really, humility is like the trump card here. So,
Yep.
starting from a
Humility
place of
wins.
humility, a desire to build understanding and compassion and respect, and that starts with us,
Mm.
not just projecting that our kids have to find that space.
Yep. Wow, that's rich and something that I'll unpack for a while. Let's just move that to kind of one other question. Just because you spend a good amount of time and have for years on a stage communicating to audiences of teenagers, how has it changed over the years? I mean, it's got to be fun to think. I can remember the first time I was speaking at a summer camp, and I went, "Wait a minute." The camp counselors were in junior high, when
Yeah,
I, you know, and
yeah,
then I spoke so many, retreats or events where the youth directors, were kids at the event. I mean, it's just crazy. But now, you've been given this opportunity where now you're speaking where, I mean, 30 years, 35, people have heard you over that. Like,
yeah,
how has it
yeah,
changed? Is there anything that you've learned that's just like, okay, I approach it differently this way?
yeah. Well, one change is really interesting, and it ties into the changes that we've seen in culture in general, but specifically in youth culture. I used to be able to, when I was a guest speaker at a large youth event, I used to be able to pick out the non-Christian kids in the room really easily.
Mm.
Um, and it was during the worship time, and I could see they were disengaged or looking uncomfortable in one way. They had a defensive posture, arms folded or hands in their pockets, and they were not singing. I cannot pick them out of the crowd anymore.
Right.
And the reason for that is a cultural change. So we have gone from a place where in the modern world, where the way we understand what's true started with facts. And in today's world, in a postmodern world, the way we understand what's true starts with experience. So I
Mm,
understand what's true based on my experience. And that can sound threatening to some people. I don't think it needs to be. I think it would have resonated pretty well with first century Christians.
yeah.
Um, and really, in many ways, the whole kind of empirical and rational thought approach to understanding what's true is a much more a product of the Enlightenment than it is anything that would have resonated with people
Mm,
in first century. Um, so, because of that, kids are willing to try on behaviors and even try on beliefs to see if it offers an experience, and in church world we would say probably a transcendent experience that helps them define or understand what's true in the world. um, and so yeah, I mean that's one big shift that I've seen.
right.
um, I would say a couple other points of advice to speaking to teenagers. One is I just found more and more that I have to speak to a need that I have, or at least find on an emotional connection to my content.
Mm,
If all I'm doing is trying to deposit good information in the heads of the people listening to me, and it's not something that I have some connection with, and I would even suggest it needs to be more than an intellectual connection. It
mm,
needs to be a heart connection in some
definitely.
way. Then that makes a giant difference in the tone of the room and in the level of engagement, and hopefully clears up space for the Holy Spirit to do really good work in those who are listening.
Mm,
Um, and then, a general principle that's true outside of teenagers, but just doubly true with teenagers, is that story is so critical. The
right.
use of story,
Right.
right? Um, and there's a whole art to that. we need to have we need to learn the skill of that with enough framing and setup, sometimes humor in there, but with a caution that too much detail ends up distracting.
Right.
So probably more than any other aspect of a talk, I'm doing a talk tomorrow night at a youth event, and I haven't started it yet. I've got to work on that today. Um, I know that I have to have the I know that my main point is like the first thing I want to land on,
Hmm.
because that's I want to teach 1 point, not 16 points. But the big rocks in the river, as I start to put it together, are what are the stories that I want to tell. One of them in this case is definitely a Bible story, and I'm going to tell that in a creative way. But what are other stories I can tell? I've also found so much more resonance with audiences of teenagers when I tell stories from my own life, particularly if I can remember stories from my life as a teenager.
Yes.
Um, and ideally, not stories where I am the conqueror, but stories that are self effacing.
Yep.
Um, and that's just, that offers all kinds of wins, particularly in engagement and attention span, as well as in the communication of important truth.
It's just huge. It's just huge. Story, yeah,
Yeah.
story wins. And for me, I found over the years, if I can get someone to laugh with me, boy, that just really starts to break down some walls, and they'll kind of lean in, and that laughter opens up the door to listening, and in a way that, if I love your phrase, if I was just depositing information, because I think so many people are like, I just got to get
Yeah.
this information into their heads.
Right. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
well, goodness gracious, you have given us, I mean, so many gems here, and I so appreciate it. I did want to say one last thing. Our last time together, you and I sat across from a table at a restaurant in San Diego. I was in the thick of our teenage son going through this massive depression, panic attacks, anxiety.
Yeah.
We didn't know if he was going to get out of bed. It'd be 16
Yeah.
hours of sleeping a day, and I just wanted to thank you. Like, you have been there for, I mean, so many years. And I think about that time, I walked away just so thankful that I had someone to talk to who could, listen, and then kind of give me some truth and to remember. And so, it was one of those moments. I have a couple of those Marco moments over the years where I'm like, okay, why did he just give me that time? But you did, and it was incredible. And so I just want to say thank you again for that. So just really appreciate it.
You bet, man.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Marco, for joining us on this episode of the Speak with People podcast. We are so excited that you could join us. We'll go ahead and put the notes in the podcast information. You can find those, and don't forget to check out thespeakersconference.com. Well, we believe words matter, and we hope that this episode helps you as you communicate with the teenagers in your life. Thank you, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks.